This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Hello everyone, I'm Eleni Jokas. You are watching CNN Newsroom live from Dubai. Tonight, Sweden and Finland are on track to become NATO members as the alliance formally invites them to join. But how will Russia react to the expansion? And then damning new testimony about Donald Trump's actions on January 6. We'll explore what might be next for the former US president. And later, 17 years. That is how long it would take to read aloud the name of every victim of Colombia's civil war. We'll have the details on a new bombshell report. It has been a monumental and incredibly productive day for NATO. The alliance has just formally invited Sweden and Finland to join. The move will expand the bloc's shared border with Russia by more than 1,300 kilometers. The US and fellow NATO leaders also unveiled plans to strengthen its forces along the eastern flank. US President Joe Biden promising to send more troops, installing more military bases and deliver more equipment to help counter Russia. NATO members are reiterating that Russia is the most significant threat to security and stability in the region, something Ukraine and its president know all too well. Mr. Zelensky addressed the summit virtually, asking what more Ukraine has to do to join NATO and asking whether it hasn't already paid the price of membership.
If
you truly define Russia as a threat, your main threat, you have to fully support its main and first target. This is not the war of Russia against Ukraine. This is the war for the right to dictate conditions for Europe, for the future world order.
Right, let's get straight to our team in Madrid. We've got CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson standing by, and we also have senior White House correspondent Phil Mattingly joining us. Great to see you both. What a day. Nick, I want to start with you. Turkey was the biggest obstacle for Sweden and Finland, and after lengthy discussions, something changed. Could you give me a sense of, firstly, what the shifts were in these discussions, and importantly, whether other leaders feel that Turkey created, sort of rattled NATO unity?
Yeah, if we go back to the moments when Finland and Sweden said that they wanted to join, officially said they wanted to join NATO, that's when Turkey came out of the woodwork. President Erdogan said that he didn't want this to happen because he was concerned about their treatment of PKK, Kurdish separatists, or in Turkey, terrorists in those countries, and he wanted that changed. It was a very public debate. It went quiet. There was a lot of back-scenes diplomacy, and a lot of that played out behind closed doors here yesterday. The president of Finland, the Prime Minister of Sweden, and President Erdogan both meeting with Jens Stoltenberg as well. President Biden played a role in all of this behind the scenes, but when I sat down earlier today with Iceland's Prime Minister, Katrin Jakobsdottir, she was quite frank in her assessment of what President Erdogan had done here. She really felt that he, and she didn't go into detail about why, but she really felt that President Erdogan had sort of hijacked this process for gains of his own. This is how she framed it.
When we said we will support Finland's and Sweden's application, we did that unconditionally out of respect for their democratic wishes. And I think actually what we have seen is that Turkey has been taking unrelated matters and putting them in as conditions. I think it's yeah, that's not the right way.
So President Biden had a conversation with President Erdogan today. We know that there's a commitment from President Erdogan to help get Ukrainian wheat and other agricultural products through the Black Sea safely to the international market, to try to provide some level of security or inject some level of security into the sort of global food insecurity situation. What else was discussed in that meeting? isn't clear, but there is clearly a sense among some of the NATO leaders that President Erdogan used that as an opportunity to get things that he needed, and it's well known that he would like to get new F-16 fighter aircraft from the United States, something that's been beyond his reach for the past few years.
Phil, I want to bring you in here, and President Biden announcing a slew of new commitments, a new presence, a stronger presence of the US in Europe. I mean, some of them, new US warships going to Spain, fighter jet squadrons to Britain, more troops to Romania. Give me a sense and break this down for us in terms of what Biden's strategy is going to be in Europe going forward.
You know, I think the best way to look at this moment and just how dramatic the last 24 hours have been has been to look at NATO when President Biden took office last year. It was kind of adrift. There was some sense that it was listless in terms of its direction. Obviously, the 4 years in President Biden's predecessor, NATO was not always the most popular alliance in that White House. That has shifted dramatically, and the U.S. posture, along with the rest of NATO, has shifted demonstrably. And today is such a great representation of that. You look, a permanent headquarters now being placed in Poland, 3,500 ground troops being sent to Romania. You mentioned the fighters going to the UK, the ships going to Spain. In every way, air, land, and sea, weaponry as well. The U.S. is upping its commitment in a surge-type capacity that we haven't seen since the Cold War. And this was a U.S. that had been rotating away from Europe as a kind of a central point of its defense posture in probably the decade leading up to it. It went from 80,000 troops in the area up to 100,000 after Russia's invasion. That will be increased by what's happening here. And there's a very clear sense, both from White House officials I've spoken to, also from the strategic concept that the alliance agreed on today, the once-in-a-decade document, that Russia and Europe and the strategic posture in Europe is very much in a different place than it was just 2 years ago because President Putin decided to invade. One other element here that I think is important, obviously Europe and what's happening in Ukraine, the focal point of a lot of the discussions today as well, but the strategic concept, that document laying out concerns related to China specifically, which has also been a big push from the U.S. side. This underscores, I think, what has been a significant amount of work behind the scenes on the U.S. side to try and bring this alliance back together, closer perhaps than it's ever been, and really put concrete issues on the table that they feel like can be deliverables coming out of this summit, deliverables they've already locked in halfway through the summit.
Yeah, Phil, and what a big change, right, from the US almost leaving NATO to now increasing its presence in Europe. Phil Mattingly, Nick Robertson, thank you so much for that insight. Great to see you both. Now let's get more context from CNN's chief international anchor, Christiane Amanpour, joins us now live from London. Christiane, really good to see you. I tell you, until yesterday when, we thought Sweden and Finland still faced one of the biggest obstacles in joining NATO, something has changed dramatically in those discussions. Turkey is now out of the way. You've been speaking to the Swedish PM. What is she telling you about the concessions that perhaps had to be made to get to this point?
Well, they don't talk about concessions. They say Turkey had, national security concerns, for instance, about the Turkish group known as the PKK, which in fact all the Western countries, including the United States, have labeled as terrorists. And they say, we haven't agreed to anything that is not already in our national law. They've heard Turkey's concerns. They say that they're going to, beef up their own terrorist legislation, but nonetheless they have terrorist legislation, in Sweden and in Finland. So I think that they've talked a little bit, of course, about lifting an existing arms embargo on NATO, or rather on Turkey, which is a NATO member. And they say that they needed to do all this because they actually need to become members of NATO because of what Putin has done to threaten not just all of Europe, but them as well after all these decades of their neutrality. But when I actually asked her about the nitty-gritty, which is what are you going to do about Ukraine, and aren't you concerned about what Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has warned that could become Ukraine fatigue, this is what the Swedish Prime Minister answered.
I'm definitely concerned about potential Ukraine fatigue. And therefore, I think it's so important that we who are leaders of our country, that we also take the time to explain to our citizens that Ukraine is not only fighting a war for Ukraine, but also for democracy's right to choose their own destiny and live in peace and freedom. And I know that the whole world is now affected by this war, but that is because Russia has decided to invade a peaceful and friendly neighbor. And therefore, this war has to stop, and Ukraine has to win the war.
And on that note, that Ukraine has to win, as she said, you know, Sweden is not even a NATO member yet, but she said that the country is already preparing its next package of military equipment to Ukraine. And she did agree that actually this whole situation calls for an escalation of military aid to Ukraine now when it needs it most. Eleni?
Yeah, it's such a vital point. And to be honest, when you see the messaging coming through from a country like Sweden that is abandoning 200 years of non-alliance, it basically brings to question whether Putin does in fact pose a risk to Europe beyond Ukraine. The leaders that you've been speaking to, Christiane, are you getting the sense that they are very concerned about this risk that could be a reality?
Well, I also spoke to the Spanish Prime Minister, who, of course, is hosting the NATO summit. And, you know, I think what NATO countries do believe is that unless you actually show some steel in front of Putin, he's going to try to push where he sees the soft underbelly. And that, of course, has now been reinforced since he invaded Ukraine with no provocation. And so what the Spanish Prime Minister told me is that maybe in the past we were somewhat, quote, naive, is his word, about Putin. Because you remember in 2010, they actually invited Russia, then it was President Medvedev of Russia, to the summit in Lisbon, and they called Russia a strategic partner. He told me, Sanchez, today, that that was probably a bit naive, given what we already knew about Russia and what it was gobbling up in Georgia and what Putin had said about NATO and so-called US hegemony around the world, that we should have understood Russia's goals earlier. He also talked to me about how this was massively important, not just saving Ukraine's independence and its sovereignty, but that meaning that it really reinforces and saves Western values and way of life. It's democratic values built around the rules of the road, the rules of law and international norms. So that's what's at stake at this NATO summit and going forward, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you know, huge tectonic shifts for NATO, just seeing what they're doing on the ground. Christiane Amanpour, really good to see you. Thank you so much for that insight. Now, moving on, shocking new details have emerged from the January 6 hearings, with a former top aide in Donald Trump's White House testifying that the president and his inner circle were all well aware of the potential for violence on the day of the insurrection. Cassidy Hutchinson gave the committee stunning insight to the events surrounding the attack on the Capitol. CNN's Pamela Brown has the story.
As an American, I was disgusted.
Bombshell testimony from surprise witness Cassidy Hutchinson, a former top aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows.
That evening was the first moment that I remember feeling scared and nervous for what could happen on January 6th.
Hutchinson telling the committee White House officials knew something big was brewing for January 6th, testifying that 4 days prior, Trump's former attorney Rudy Giuliani told her Trump himself planned to go to the Capitol on the 6th.
We're going to the Capitol. It's going to be great. The president's going to be there. He's going to look powerful.
And when she approached Meadows for more details, she says Meadows gave an ominous response.
He didn't look up from his phone and said something to the effect of, "There's a lot going on, Cass, but I don't know. Things might get real bad on January 6th.
After, things did get real bad at the Capitol. According to Hutchinson, lead White House counsel Pat Cipollone pleaded with Meadows to get Trump to do something to stop it, saying,
"Mark, something needs to be done or people are going to die and the blood's going to be on your effing hands. This is getting out of control."
And even when the rioters began to chant, Meadows told Cipollone Trump believed Pence deserves it.
Mark had responded something to the effect of, "You heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong."
Hutchinson said on January 7th, Meadows encouraged Trump to condemn the rioters to salvage his legacy.
There's already talks about invoking the 25th Amendment. You need this as cover.
And Hutchinson described seeing Trump express rage various times over stories regarding his 2020 election loss. One such time after his former attorney general told the Associated Press he had not seen widespread fraud that would change the election.
There was ketchup dripping down the wall, and there's a shattered porcelain plate on the floor. The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall.
A former Trump loyalist, Hutchinson testified that watching the violence and destruction unfold on January 6th was devastating.
It was unpatriotic. It was un-American. We were watching the Capitol building get defaced over a lie. It's something that I still struggle to work through the emotions of that.
Another revelation coming out from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony is that Mark Meadows, her former boss, and Trump's former attorney Rudy Giuliani sought presidential pardons relating to January 6th. Now, we do want to note the Secret Service released a statement in the wake of the allegations that the former president lunged at the wheel in the presidential motorcade because he wanted to go to the Capitol. Now, in response to that, the Secret Service says that it has been cooperating with the Select Committee since its inception in spring 2021 and will continue to do so, including by responding on the record to the committee regarding the new allegations surfaced in today's testimony. Pamela Brown, CNN, Capitol Hill.
Hutchinson's testimony has brought strong responses among U.S. lawmakers and the public. But what lasting impact might it have? Many Americans on both sides of the aisle already had made up their minds about Donald Trump and the Capitol attack. CNN's Ryan Nobles joins us from Washington to discuss what comes next. Look, many people have faced charges that were directly involved. But could Trump and his team face charges as well? I mean, this is now the big question. Do these hearings have any repercussions for the people involved at the top?
Eleni, there's no doubt that that's the biggest question that many people still have as this committee continues to push forward with its work. And I think there were a lot of people that were skeptical that these hearings would really move the ball in the direction toward possible prosecution. And it's clear that it is starting to change some minds. Members of the committee have openly said that they believe that enough evidence has been uncovered to charge the former president and some of his top deputies with a crime. And what we saw in this testimony yesterday was the testimony that the White House counsel at the time, Pat Cipollone, was warning the former president that if he continued down certain paths that he could be at risk of legal exposure. The big question, though, is does the Department of Justice feel that way? They're the only ones that have the authority to bring in a grand jury and panel a grand jury, hand down an indictment, and really truly open up a prosecution. There is the possibility that the January 6th Select Committee, which has no prosecutorial oversight, may actually formally ask the Department of Justice to do that. That has no legal standing. It would just put on political pressure on the Department of Justice. But it is clear that that pressure is increasing with each new bit of information that the January 6th Select Committee has to offer.
All right, Ryan Nobles, thank you so much for that update. Right, and still to come tonight, verdicts are coming in right now in France in the trial over the 2015 Paris terror attacks. We'll go live to the French capital with details on that verdict. And also, Russia is escalating attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. We'll talk about the war with an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister. Stay with CNN.
This is a really important story. My name's Clarissa Ward. I work for CNN.
Assalamu alaikum.
Day in, day out, you see the reality of people living through this.
Ничего страшного.
Okay.
This is the front line.
On a human level, you find courage, sacrifice. This is what life is about.
A lot of people are wondering why.
You see the worst of humanity.
Putin might use a nuclear weapon. Absolutely terrifying.
But you also see the best of humanity. My job is to be present.
The human cost is right here.
And to tell these stories.
We're talking about families.
That is the most important thing. I'm Clarissa Ward in Ukraine. This is CNN.
My name's Jim Brailsford, and I lead the Industry and Solutions Marketing team for Kinaxis. It's absolutely key that businesses incorporate sustainability into their business models. Firstly, you have got the corporate objective and being a good global citizen. You've also got the need to be reflecting that to your public, to your consumers, that show that you are actually being environmentally conscious. And also, as supply chains are more mature and are considering all of these things in a holistic way, it develops a sort of a steadiness to their operation. Supply chain sustainability will become a qualifier. It will not necessarily be the winner, but it'll become a qualifier enabling you to participate in the competition.
Across Africa, businesses are working together like never before. All new on CNN, Connecting Africa.
Join me, Eleni Jokos, as we crisscross the continent to show you how new connections are revolutionizing commerce in Africa. This month, Connecting Africa from the Africa CEO Forum here in Côte d'Ivoire.
This forum really brings Africans together.
Connecting Africa on CNN, in association with Afreximbank.
Welcome back. I'm Eleni Jokos in Dubai. Now, the head of Colombia's Truth Commission says it would take 17 years to read aloud the name of every victim of the country's brutal civil war. The Commission's 800-page report, just out now, details how Colombia's military battled rebels. Known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, for nearly 6 decades, the conflict drew in paramilitary groups and the US, which gave billions of dollars to Colombia to fight the rebels and the drug trade that funded FARC. Most of the conflict's victims were ordinary Colombians, and at least 220,000 people were killed, and 34,000 children were seized by guerrillas to fight. Stefano Botsebon joins us now live from the Colombian capital, Bogota. Stefano, I mean, listening to some of those details, it's going to take 17 years to read aloud all the victims of the civil war. Give me a sense of some of the outcomes, some of the things we've seen in this 800-page document.
Yes, Eleni, what really stands in front at the forefront of these historic report is just the sheer scale of this conflict that really touched every single aspect of Colombian society. And the main finding is that the vast majority, the sheer majority, between 70 and 80% of the casualties in the conflict were civilians, ordinary Colombian. And so this report is, if you want, the final moment in a long healing process that this nation has gone through since beginning the negotiations between the Colombian state and the FARC back in 2015, that blossomed into this historic peace agreement in 2016. And for the past 6 years, this Truth Commission investigated, did research, held more than spoke with more than 30,000 people to get to the bottom of what happened and how it could be allowed to happen. Perhaps the most important part of the report that was published yesterday are the recommendations that the president of the Truth Commission, Padre Francisco de Roo, gave to the Colombian elected president-elect, Gustavo Petro. Among the recommendations are a complete overhaul of the way that the Colombian military forces are run and a strategic rethinking of the war on drugs, which of course in a country like Colombia plays a large part in this conflict, because it's not just about the past and how much sufferance has this nation lived through, but also about the future and how can this country and the rest of the world learn from this conflict to prevent similar situations, Eleni.
Yeah, and this Truth Commission, this report, are there going to be any repercussions I mean, what is the outcome going to be at the end of the day?
One thing that might sound strange if you're not familiar with the Colombian peace process, this report is not legally binding, so there are no sentences. But there is another institution that is also spurred from the Colombian peace process, which is a special jurisdiction for peace, a peace tribunal that is hearing, trying armed actors and people who were involved in the conflict and handing out sentences. The report from yesterday was more of a moment for the nation to come together and try to understand just the scale, the magnitude of what happened in this country. It's a process that has been linked or compared to the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland or to the end of the apartheid in South Africa. And it's, of course, a process that is not free from controversy. While yesterday the President-elect, Gustavo Petro, was present and received the report from the hands of Francisco de Ruz, the President of the Commission, the current President, Ivan Duque, who campaigned against the 2016 peace deal, was not present in the future. So you can see that even after 6 years of that historic peace agreement that was signed in 2016, the issue of the peace and how can Colombia heal its wound remains controversial.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's about healing the wounds, right, through these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Stefano Bozzabon, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you. All right, and news just in, the court in Paris just handed down its verdict in a trial of suspects involved in the November 2015 terror attacks. The Bataclan Music Hall, 6 bars and restaurants, and the area near the Stade de France Stadium were all targeted that night. 130 people were slaughtered. The main suspect was found guilty of all 5 charges, including murder and terrorism. The 32-year-old had started the trial by proudly saying that he was a soldier of the Islamic State. He's the only surviving member of the group that is suspected to have carried out these coordinated attacks. Now, the death toll is at 53 in the tractor-trailer tragedy in Texas. The bodies of 40 men and 13 women were found inside a swelteringly hot truck abandoned in San Antonio. They were migrants from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mexico's Attorney General is opening an investigation into the deaths. Now, there was no sign of water or any air conditioning in the truck when authorities found it Monday. The route where the truck was found is often used by human smugglers. 3 people are currently in custody. Hundreds of thousands of homes and entire neighborhoods along the India-Bangladesh border are entirely underwater. The Bangladesh Red Cross says South Asia is being hit by its worst flooding in living memory. 7 million people in Bangladesh alone are in desperate need of shelter and emergency aid. The region has endured weeks of torrential rain, with access to many areas largely cut off. Now, still to come tonight, crews in Ukraine are still searching for people missing after a strike on a shopping mall. We'll get an update on the war and speak to an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister just ahead.
Back in the days, they used to do sedu weaving, to do tents, palm leaf weaving to cover roofs, and telly to decorate clothing. But nowadays, it's starting to fade. This is one of the special nice baskets. It's a very unique palm weaving. This technique is really very difficult. We create shoes, candles, coasters, packaging. The sky is the limit. It's our duty or our responsibility to keep it and pass it to next generations.
travel the world? Make sure the world travels with you. Check in, log on, and get connected with all of the latest developments at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels. Connected to your world.
Our mission here at CNN and journalists, the news comes first. That's when your heart beats a little bit faster. More breaking news that we are following right now. You really work as hard as you can, getting the facts. We're learning more about our lead plot. It is critically important.
To our viewers in the United States and around the world, welcome to the Situation Room. We have breaking news.
I'm Mindy Kincaid in Atlanta, and this is CNN.
Ukraine is accusing Russian forces of using scorched earth tactics as they try to storm the last pockets of resistance in the Luhansk region. A regional governor calls the situation in Lysychansk very difficult, saying it's under constant bombardment. He says Russian soldiers are planting mines in the city, posing a deadly risk to civilians. Russia is also escalating attacks in the south. The mayor of Mykolaiv says at least 4 people were killed today in a missile strike on an apartment building. And in central Ukraine, crews are still searching for dozens of people missing after a strike on a shopping mall. This surveillance video captured Monday's explosion. At least 18 people were killed. Correspondent Scott McLean is in Kyiv for us. Scott, good to see you. We're seeing more and more footage emerging, and it's just showing the extent of the impact of this missile strike. Do we know how many people have been impacted by this attack?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, at least 18 dead. We know that there are more than 50 who have been hospitalized. We are told that the vast majority of those are with serious injuries. We also know that right now there are crews who have been on site since this strike took place, picking through what is left of that shopping mall, and truth be told, there is not a whole lot left. It is a shell of its former self, if you can even call it that. They are going through trying to dismantle the steel, the twisted metal that is left of the mall, and they are also looking for bodies. They assume that there are no survivors left, so they're looking for bodies. What they have found thus far is 11 body parts. What they have to figure out is how many bodies those parts actually belong to. It is pretty grim work. You mentioned the impact in that really stunning CCTV video. We're talking about a bomb that's 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds of payload. That is a lot of explosive material. It's an older missile, but still capable of doing a heck of a lot of damage, as we saw. And there's other security footage from a nearby park where people were taking a stroll around a pond. One person, upon hearing or seeing some kind of a warning a few seconds before, takes a kid, runs behind a tree. Another person actually jumps inside of the pond to try to take shelter from the hot shrapnel that's raining down, Eleni.
Yeah, extraordinary footage, Scott. We were focusing on Mariupol for such a long time, and then we know that the people that were trapped inside Azovstal steel plants, many of the soldiers were taken to Russian territory. Now some of them have been released in a prisoner swap. Could you give me details?
Yeah, so this was about a month ago, obviously, when this surrender took place. There were about 2,500 or so Ukrainian soldiers who put down their arms. We know that about 1,000 of them were taken to Russia, not just Russian-held territory, but to Russia for investigative purposes, according to the Russians. Well, now some of them are now free on Ukrainian soil. There were 144 Ukrainian soldiers that were swapped for 144 Russian soldiers and soldiers from the Donetsk People's Republic, those breakaway regions as well. We are told that soldiers on both sides are badly wounded. In the case of the Ukrainians, their injuries range from broken bones to burns to amputated legs. The list goes on. These are some of these soldiers in really bad shape. The question is, will there be more prisoner exchanges for the more able-bodied soldiers who were able to hold out inside of that Azovstal steel plant? 95 of the 144, by the way, Eleni, were inside that steel plant. 43, I think is the number, were from the Azov regiment. This is a little bit surprising considering that they would be released, considering that Russia has really tried to paint this wing of the Ukrainian military as neo-Nazis, as extremists. They certainly had extremist origins, but they've now been folded into the regular Ukrainian military. It is, on the other hand, not surprising because, as President Zelensky points out, these are some very public prisoners that Russia has. And of course, the world is watching. Eleni?
Absolutely. Scott McLean, thank you so much. Let's bring in now an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister. Yuri Sak is joining us from Western Ukraine. Yuri, thank you so much for taking the time to give us an update. We've been watching this footage of the missile attack on the shopping mall in Kyiv. It is incredible to see just the sheer impact and, of course, the loss of life here. Could you give me a sense, in your assessment, what the Russians were actually targeting when they struck the mall? Some say it might have been a nearby factory, or do you believe it was a specific target on civilians?
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. From the very first day of this war, we knew and we saw evidence of a simple fact. Russia is a terrorist state, which is targeting civilian targets, which is hitting with their missiles residential areas, kindergartens, schools, hospitals. So in the case of the missile strike at Kremenchuk shopping mall, which took the lives of a minimum of 18 people and many more were injured, this is another evidence that Russia is not going to stop. Russia continues to employ these terror tactics. And this is why we believe that the whole civilized world has to recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Some countries have already done that. Some countries are planning to do. And it's a very logical step to take following these developments.
Yuri, I have to ask you, when the Russians exited Kyiv and there was sort of the sense of safety or some kind of return to normalcy in Kyiv, and that's the conversations we've been having with people on the ground. But do you think there was a false sense of security all these weeks? Were you shocked by this attack? Did you anticipate that Kyiv would once again become a target?
Well, this latest target, this was a shopping mall in Kremenchuk, not in Kyiv. But indeed, Kyiv was a target of another attack just 3 days ago. And another Ukrainian city, Mykolaiv, was a target again today in the early hours of the morning. And a 6-year-old child was removed from the rubble, a dead child. Overall, 341 children were killed in this war by now. The intensity of the missile strikes, as you know, has increased tremendously during the last couple of days. Russians are shooting over 50 missiles a day, targeting different Ukrainian cities, not just those in the east. Any Ukrainian city today is a target for a Russian missile strike. This is why our political and military leadership continues to say that we need more modern air gun systems. We need more anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems, because we are fighting for the values of the Western democracy and freedom. We are fighting for the whole world. All we need is, assistance, military assistance from our international partners.
Yeah, and they've said they're committing to that. The question is it coming quick enough? Yuri Sak, thank you so much. That's all we have time for, but we wish you all the best. Thank you so much for that insight. All right, let's go back to that breaking news. A court in Paris has just handed down its verdict in a trial of suspects involved in the November 2015 terror attacks. The main suspect was found guilty on all 5 counts he faced, including murder and terrorism. The 32-year-old had started the trial by proudly saying that he was a soldier of the Islamic State. He's the only surviving member of the group that is suspected to have carried out the coordinated attacks. 130 people were slaughtered, making it the worst peacetime attack on France. Melissa Bell is standing by in Paris. Melissa, listening to how he started in the trial, saying that he was proudly part of the Islamic State. Give me a sense of what we heard in the courtroom, and importantly, the messaging around the verdict.
Well, what has been so interesting over the course of these last 10 months, as you say, this extraordinary trial, 333 lawyers involved, more than 1,000 civil parties taking part to try and see whether justice could be brought. In the end, it was 20 suspects on trial. 14 of them have been present over the course of the last 10 months. 6 of them tried in absentia, 5 of them believed to have died in Syria. But the one that everybody was looking at was Salah Abdeslam. Now, you'll remember that the night of those terrible attacks, when 130 people were killed, between about 9 p.m. and midnight, when that rampage began with those simultaneous attacks on various bars, restaurants, the Stade de France as well. These were 10 men in that commando unit. Others, including those who were on trial these last 10 months, had helped with the logistics, the preparation. As François Hollande, the French president at the time, had said, this was an attack that had been planned in Syria, organized in Belgium and carried out on French soil. The point was what was going to be handed down to Salah Abdeslam, because, Eleni, he was the last surviving member of that 10-man commando who actually carried out those attacks, who were here that night in Paris. Now, Salah Abdeslam, over the course of the trial, rather changed his attitude to begin with. After he'd been captured after a man found in Belgium, he'd been remarkably silent. In the beginning, pledging his allegiance once again, explaining that his devotion to Islam, and then really not giving terribly much detail about his participation for many months. That changed over the course of the last few weeks, with Salah Abdeslam giving more information than he had, beginning to speak, beginning to repent, saying that he felt for the people who died. It's important to point out that his defense had hinged on the fact that of the 10, his explosive vest had not been detonated. Not only was he was the only survivor, but he was also, he said, the only one who had not actually killed anyone. In fact, in court these last few weeks, he said, I didn't even put a scratch on anyone. And therefore, in the very last opportunity he had to speak to the court, he said, condemning me for these acts would be an injustice. And yet, that is what has just happened. 19 of the 20 defendants found guilty of the charges against them, and he found guilty of all 5 counts against him. Now, we expect a little bit later tonight, because it's taking some time to read out not just the convictions but the sentences, to find out what sentence will be handed down to Salah Abdeslam. He is facing, and the prosecution has called for life in prison without parole. Now, that is the harshest sentence that French justice can hand down. It's very rarely given down here in France, and we'll find out in a moment whether or not that is to be the case, Eleni.
Yeah. And Melissa will catch up with you on that as we anticipate the sentencing. Thank you so much. And we'll be right back after a short break. Stay with CNN.
From the tiniest warbler to the mightiest whale shark, nature is on the move, but natural paths are under threat. Now meet incredible conservationists, helping species cross highways, span flyways, and get from A to B.
This is nature's highway, and we must protect it.
Call to Earth, protecting nature's highways.
Saturday on CNN.
Sodexo was created more than 50 years ago by my father, Pierre Bellon. And it's a global catering company and services company all over the world. We have fans in stadium, we have visitors in a museum, we have guests in the conference centers, and Sodexo Life is there to make memorable experiences to all these people. I think it's very important to work with people. We have to work in team spirit. This is very important, to engage them. Team spirit, team of progress. I think it's very, very, spirit of progress is very important. We have to every day do better than the day before, you know, this is important. And also spirit of growth, this is important too.
On our series Mission Ahead, we introduce you to scientists and entrepreneurs on a mission to change the way we move, even the way we walk. It's an act that many of us take for granted, but for people with physical disabilities, movement can require a lot more thought, if it's even possible at all. Today, we meet a professor who's working to change that. Here's CNN's Rachel Crane.
It's an unseasonably cool summer day in Concord, New Hampshire, where Professor Hugh Herr is out for a morning stroll at the vineyard he purchased in 2018.
I can really think clearly in such a natural environment.
An avid outdoorsman since childhood, Herr says he was considered a prodigy in the sport of rock climbing by the age of 13. But 4 years later, in 1982, he suffered a mountaineering accident that would change the trajectory of his life.
So my legs were amputated below the knee due to tissue damage from frostbite.
Frustrated by the crude prosthetics he was given, the teenager set out to improve their design.
I developed this passion of returning to climbing and began viewing the artificial limb as an opportunity.
An imaginative mind bolstered by subsequent degrees in physics and engineering, capped off with a PhD in biophysics, led him to the MIT Media Lab.
In the biomechatronics group here at MIT, we develop wearable robots that attach to the body.
It's here that the professor conceived and developed this bionic device, and 2 others on the market today. Products that patients access through their insurance plans, Herr says. For each, Herr says it can take around a decade of tinkering and testing, including on himself.
This is the history of the ankles I'm wearing. And because I know technically exactly what's happening in the prototype, I'm very quickly able to debug, if you will.
Amy, could you do foot up?
Today in the lab,
Rest.
2 PhD students are working with patient volunteer Amy Petrofetta to improve the functionality of a new prototype.
After we work on the flexor, we're going to work on extensor so that we will have a pair for her ankle control.
Petrofetta is one of around 40 patients who has undergone a procedure conceptualized by her and developed by surgeons, Herr says. Opposing muscles in the amputated limb are reconnected, re-establishing the neural link between the muscles and brain. Add electrodes, and the amputee can control their prosthesis like a natural limb. Herr is now working on a technology that could improve an amputee's use of their bionic limb further by replacing the electrodes with magnets.
The signal that you get from those electrodes is very noisy. So we want to put the technology inside the body with tiny little magnetic spheres that we use to track the precise movements of the muscles. And then we can communicate that to inform the exact movements of the bionic limb.
If you think this sounds like the stuff you'd only find in movies such as Star Wars, you might want to think again.
These concepts are no longer in the realm of science fiction. They're becoming science fact that fundamentally changes how humans move, how we transport our bodies through space.
All right, we'll be right back after the short break. Stay with CNN.
Mission Ahead, in association with Fujifilm, value from innovation.
Growing up around individuals that were dedicated to service served as a great example for how I wanted to live my life. You grow up with the mentality of how do you support the person next to you. At Fujifilm, partnership is at the core of what we do. We partner with pharmaceutical companies to help develop and manufacture biopharmaceuticals. Being in a profession where you can help people, it's extremely motivating. It's why we're doing what we're doing.
Air Quality Update, in association with Copernicus, Europe's Eyes on Earth. Air Quality Update, in association with Copernicus, Europe's Eyes on Earth.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Across Africa, businesses are working together like never before. All new on CNN, Connecting Africa.
Join me, Eleni Jokos, as we crisscross the continent to show you how new connections are revolutionizing commerce in Africa. This month, Connecting Africa from the Africa CEO Forum here in Côte d'Ivoire.
This forum really brings Africans together.
Connecting Africa on CNN, in association with Afreximbank.
Welcome back. Now, security is being ramped up in Hong Kong ahead of a visit from Chinese President Xi Jinping. His trip on Friday marks 25 years since the city's handover from British to Chinese rule. Back then, Beijing promised Hong Kong would retain its freedoms. But today, many criticize its lack of autonomy. CNN's Chrissy Lu Stout has this report on what's left of the promise. One country, two systems.
The Sino-British relations.
After Margaret Thatcher reached a deal with the Chinese on the return of Hong Kong, a local reporter took the Iron Lady to task.
You signed an agreement with China promising to deliver over 5 million people into the hands of a communist dictatorship.
Thatcher claimed mostly everyone in Hong Kong was happy with the deal and told Emily Lau,
"You may be a solitary exception."
So what do you make of that answer today in 2022?
Many of the journalists who subsequently stood up, they asked similar questions. So even in that room, I wasn't a solitary exception.
July 1, 2022 marks exactly halfway through 50 years of the one country, two systems autonomy Beijing promised to Hong Kong at the 1997 handover. It aims to preserve the city's freedoms of expression and assembly, as well as its institutions, including an independent judiciary.
But in the wake of the 2019 protests, pressure on the city's freedoms intensified thanks to a new national security law. Supporters say the law ended the chaos of 2019 and restored order, but it did more than that. Scenes of mass protests like this are no more. At least 186 people have been arrested under the law, including a 90-year-old Catholic cardinal. The opposition is virtually wiped out, with many of the city's pro-democracy figures in jail or exile. Politically charged artworks like the Pillar of Shame Tiananmen Memorial have been removed. Dozens of civil society groups, including the city's largest independent trade union, have disbanded. And national security investigations have led to the shuttering of news outlets like the Apple Daily. When asked about charges of diminished freedoms, a Hong Kong government spokesman told CNN many freedoms and rights are not absolute and can be restricted for reasons including protection of national security and public safety. So, as former security chief John Lee prepares to lead the city from July 1, what is left of Hong Kong's promised autonomy?
We have autonomy in religion, in education, in media, including social media, in the internet, in how we manage our civil service. The second system is still here. It is functioning. It's under stress.
We want Hong Kong to be free. Lau has always been a skeptic of one country, two systems. As a reporter, a lawmaker, and former chair of the Democratic Party.
I will